can't just run away from your problems, Indiana. Watch me.
Hey guys, it's Matt here, once again hitting you up with a video I wasn't initially planning on making. But it just so happened to be that a few weeks ago I found myself rewatching one of the most fun and adventurous trilogies from the 1980s, which I have not yet developed a complete aversion to, right around the same time I decided to spend €1 whole on a 2-week Xbox Game Pass trial. It is of course the lesser milk for all it's worth franchise made famous by Spielberg and Lucas, Indiana Jones. The stars must have aligned this week, because without paying any attention to this game whatsoever, all previously mentioned reasons steered me straight into the path where I fired up my computer, seeing the newly released Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, and thinking to myself, that's a dumb name for a video game. But I might give it a try, and then accidentally from the very moment I started it realizing that, wait a second, I'm actually really enjoying this game. So, without any further delay, here's some gameplay and my surprisingly positive first impressions of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Oh, and even though this video will only contain mild spoilers from the early hours of the game, in my opinion, it's even more fun when going into it completely unspoiled, so keep that in mind. Lately, the 1980s have made some sort of comeback in the pop culture landscape. Synthesizers have become as commonplace as banjos in the 2010s, everyone has at least one friend with a mullet or a disgusting mustache, and we're greeted with a completely unnecessary sequel to something that came out 45 years ago, basically on a monthly basis. And video games can't fall behind, of course. Even here we see the 1980s represented more often than ever, no matter if it's done by setting the game in that era, continuing stories of that era, or including characters from that era. Rambo and John McClane in a Call of Duty game that in and of itself was set in the 80s. Every single instance of Back to the Future being mentioned anywhere, and even a surprisingly good RoboCop game seemingly out of nowhere. But in that regard, I feel like Indiana Jones has been getting the short end of the stick for far too long now. That might mostly come from my refusal to acknowledge the existence of the last two movies, but even in video games he has been underrepresented. Outside of a small cameo here and there, his last noteworthy game released a full 15 years ago. And as we all know, that is definitely a Lego game first and foremost. So let me just start off by saying this right from the get-go. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is long overdue, and without a doubt in my mind, the best Indiana Jones game ever. If you're a longtime fan of this character and have been waiting for your entire life for a game which feels exactly like the only 3 movies made within this franchise, well, congratulations, here you go, this is it. Now I can't see a problem in the game costing 70 and even up to €100. I can also understand the hesitation about anything even slightly related to Bethesda nowadays, believe me. And I can also understand why it might raise some doubts to see a developer mainly known for their fast-paced first-person shooters to be working on a much slower-paced puzzle adventurer. But what I can absolutely guarantee you is that Indiana Jones fans will love this game, and that will become noticeable from the very first second of playing. Set in 1937, The Great Circle is centered around the time period between the first and third movie, but you'll actually start 1 year earlier by playing through this incredible, almost frame-by-frame recreation of the opening scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark, setting the stage not just for how mind-bogglingly good this game looks at times and how exciting this game is going to be, but also by stuffing your face with a much appreciated but not overdone amount of fan service. Forget about those fever-dreamerish janky CGI sequences in that movie that luckily doesn't exist, because this game is all you're ever going to need in that department. And luckily I'm not just talking about the environments, because character models are just as impressive. Yeah, we'd all expect to see Indy in his own game, but what a treat to see Alfred Molina faithfully recreated in what was his very first movie appearance.
Give me the whip!
Adios, senor.
Probably the most important part of how this is sold so well is the game's voice acting. Every single person here does an amazing job, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Indiana Jones's voice sounds eerily similar to an actual young Harrison Ford.
He was good. He was very, very good.
Senor.
Did these developers comb the streets to just find the best Indiana Jones impersonator they could find? Well, yeah, sort of. In what came to be the most and simultaneously least surprising realization for me within this game, I found out that this is just a very good reenactment of the famous actor by voice acting legend and Joel himself, Troy Baker. Top it off with a great soundtrack that manages to retain the adventurous feel of a classic Spielberg movie, despite that iconic original soundtrack not even being that prevalent in the game. And we're off to a great start. These initial minutes give you a very good impression of how faithful the game will stay to its source material, almost as if Spielberg and Lucas themselves are involved. And while there are rumors all over the internet of that actually being the case, I couldn't find any actual confirmation of that anywhere. What I can confirm is that developer Machine Games, mostly known for their Wolfenstein reboot, apparently were given the opportunity to make this game simply because they were already familiar with the concept of killing Nazis, which is just hilarious to me.
Nazi scum.
But there are actually a lot of similarities between this game and previous games from this developer. From the cinematic cutscenes to certain mannerisms and character models that are undoubtedly made in the id Tech engine, to things seen in director Jens Anderson's previous games, most notably The Darkness and The Chronicles of Riddick. Anyway, despite this being a great intro to the game, the actual story will start at Marshall College in Connecticut in 1937. Where a mysterious giant of a man breaks into the college's museum wing in order to get his hands on a seemingly insignificant mummified cat. This will ignite a treasure hunt all across the globe, where Indy, together with the help of reporter Gina, will fight and puzzle solve their way through many different locations, such as the Vatican, Egypt, and, well, I'm not going to spoil any more locations because it's so much more fun to find out about it yourself. They will stumble upon some heavy resistance by several different groups of 1930s bad guys. For example, Indy's good old friends the Nazis, led here by an entirely new antagonist, Emmerich Voss. A man that seriously steals every single scene he's in.
Geben Sie ihr, was ich will, oder Sie werden zum Ausgestoßenen. Ein Schandfleck auf dem Antlitz der Kirche, haben Sie das verstanden?
If this doesn't sound familiar to hardcore Indiana Jones fans, that'd be correct. This game isn't some sort of small side story or a spin-off in the same universe. It is a full-fledged new adventure set right in between the original trilogy. And as I've said before, that all starts within Marshall College, where you're getting the hang of the game's investigations mechanics. Though what I actually mean to say is that the game just lets you run around freely, finding as much or as less as you want yourself. The game immediately does something I really appreciate and I think isn't done enough in modern games. It keeps you in the game at all time. You can pick up all these different notes, books, maps, etc., yet these don't become some sort of menu that pauses the game. No, instead you can just continue walking while, for example, checking your minimap, reading through your notes in order to find the next clue. Even abilities are unlocked by picking up books and reading them on the go. Menus in general are kept at an extreme minimum. The best example is when you quit the game and later re-enter. You're almost permanently back into the action in a way that makes it look like you never left. As if the developers are trying to give you the feeling that you're watching one of those movies and quickly paused it to go take a shit. In fact, there are many ways in which the developers want to make you feel like you're actually watching a movie. A good example is how you can play the entire game in a cinematic widescreen. This introduction in the school also gives you a very good impression of what the game's overall pacing is going to be. Stealth is very prevalent and basically your most powerful weapon. Staying in the shadow and avoiding enemies is always easier than fighting them head on. You'll get your first taste of the game's fighting mechanics when fighting the earlier mentioned monstrosity called Locus, played by the unfortunately very recently deceased Tony Todd, who played in way more video games than I ever realized. The melee combat isn't that much more intricate than anything we've already seen before. Hitting, pushing, blocking and parrying all function in a way that will feel easily recognizable. Though I do like the way it is implemented here because of its stamina system. Each hit will cost you a bit of your stamina, and the harder you hit, the more it'll cost you. So you definitely need to think about when to punch or block before you find yourself in front of the entire army with an empty stamina bar. Getting away at that point is also out of the question, of course, since running isn't possible with low stamina. But as soon as you get the hang of things, and especially when you don't take on too many people at once, these are some pretty decent melee mechanics. And definitely as soon as you unlock more abilities for Indy's signature weapon, the lasso. Staying silent is, however, still your best option, but keep in mind that there really isn't anything resembling a silent takedown in the early game. You can finish most enemies off with a more powerful knockout blow, but that'll cost you more stamina, and it definitely won't be silent. All things to consider when you do decide to fight out in the open.
Pleasure is all mine.
Investigation is a close second in your roster of useful weapons, since carefully looking through every nook and cranny will basically always be rewarding. People like myself who play RPGs without any sense of self-control as far as picking up and taking items goes will have a field day with this game. Every single environment you'll cross will be filled with useful items. This could be a bottle you can throw to distract guards, a melee weapon in order to take them out, or even a key to unlock a secret shortcut and avoid confrontation altogether. But what I mostly liked about it is that this hugely expands the game's story and its world. You'll have to find and actually read certain notes in order to progress or solve a puzzle. That's not anything new, of course, it has been done before, but I don't think it has ever been this rewarding. And as far as world building goes, I really enjoy historical settings in video games, and this one just so happens to be set in a time period that is rarely seen in video games. So you can probably understand my excitement when the second chapter brought us to 1930s fascist Italy, when the country was still led by that ridiculous dictator and his black shirt minions, Benito Mussolini.
Amico mio, il Papa è debole, moribondo. Preferireste irritare lui o irritare me?
Of course, this is a fictional story throughout, but you'll be surprised how much real-life history is intertwined with Indy's story throughout those movies, and now also in this game. In my opinion, it makes it that much more interesting to both see and read about the influence Mussolini had on pre-war Italy, and how both fascism and corruption had a tight grip on the Catholic Church around that point in time. Of course, it also makes me curious how Indy is going to beat the crap out of these evils. And you've probably seen it already, but Italy, or to be more specific, the Vatican, has yet again been wonderfully recreated here. Sistine Chapel and everything, which has finally been finished since the last time we visited 430 years ago. The way this game is structured reminded me of Mario Odyssey a bit. Despite there being a main story taking you all around the world, which you could potentially finish within a few hours, it is very obvious that the developers intended for you to spend much longer in each level. Basically every single level is its own tiny open world, filled with side quests, collectibles, fetch quests, secrets, puzzles, and you can go on like that. Every single one of these locations really feels alive, with both enemies and pedestrians inhabiting all of these areas. Some just aimlessly walking around, while you'll see others perform chores or walking the guard. Halfway through the Vatican chapter, you'll get a camera, which becomes an important item throughout the game. But it's also just a lot of fun to run around these worlds and aimlessly take pictures of everything, especially the specific things you can capture for XP.
Your Smooshki. There you are.
And yes, they are side quests, so there will always be a few repetitive ones in between them, but yet again, I was just positively surprised how many unique ones there were. And even the more repetitive ones, like gathering medicine for the Vatican's nurse Valeria, was at least rewarding because it gives you access to some useful perks that buff your health. Now I can see this become a bit of a slog towards the end of the game, since there really is a lot to do in each separate area. But for now, I remain pretty positive. But when I reach the game's traversal, that's where my positivity starts to dwindle a bit more. You see, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is a first-person game, yet it uses a whole lot of parkour-esque mechanics in order to get from point A to point B. That's not a bad thing. There are many examples of games that made this work perfectly in a first-person perspective. Mirror's Edge is my personal favorite, but even Machine Games themselves had some pretty decent first-person climbing mechanics in their Wolfenstein games. Here, however, they chose to switch to a third-person perspective each time you grab onto a ledge or swing on your lasso, which makes the whole sequence so needlessly clunky. I think that's mainly because the camera remains tightly focused on the back of Indy's head. So I don't really expect any Ezio's or Nathan Drakes in this game, even though both of those characters were actually portrayed as being really athletic even when they got older. But the way Indy moves across beams or pulls himself up on his lasso makes the gameplay crawl down to a snail's pace. It is a huge shame that in a game with this much verticality I was actively trying to stay on the floor at all times, since running was just that much faster, even when upgrading these abilities. And in that sort of way you find many instances where gameplay mechanics can just be a bit clunky. You don't feel that snappiness of an Assassin's Creed game, so you can easily fall off roofs, and that will either kill you or alert all the guards, which basically has the same result. Indy won't always grab onto ledges when you want him to, some areas may seem accessible but turn out not to be, etc. By no means are these occurrences game-breaking, but they will be slightly inconvenient and frustrating bumps on the road towards the eventual end credits. Same can be said for the combat, or to be more specific, firearms. You'd think a developer like Machine Games and their Wolfenstein Reboot series, using the id Tech engine used most recently for Doom Eternal, to have some well-working weapons in this game as well, but firearms are by far the least effective weapon to use. I do understand why. I mean, just look at the entirety of Indiana Jones' movies and you can already see that Indy barely uses the things. But every single weapon just feels needlessly inaccurate and useless. The majority of the time you won't have enough ammo for the confrontations you'll find yourself in when using these firearms. Enemies shooting at you will do a lot of damage, so you'll probably die anyway, and no matter how you look at it, stealth is just always a better option. Honestly, it would have been a far better option if you could just flip the gun upside down and use it as a melee weapon instead.
Hell of a drop.
Huh. Well, there you go. Lastly, I want to talk about something that I do miss but don't want to go too deep into, simply because I haven't finished the game yet. These initial hours of gameplay were exactly the kind of thing I really enjoy in video games, but I can also admit and understand how this might be too slow-paced for some people, which definitely makes sense. Throughout these slower-paced semi-open world sections, I would have expected some larger-than-life set pieces, maybe even as over-the-top as something you see in a Call of Duty game, or something from this developer's previous games. That isn't really the case. Don't get me wrong, there are some incredible cinematic moments in the game, and I'll say it again, the acting is just brilliant. But somehow I might have expected just a bit more action in between the exploration. Some of the set pieces I've seen so far did look incredible, but gameplay wise they weren't that impressive at all. The reason I don't want to delve too deep into this aspect is because the game's third act might actually still have some action-packed tricks up its sleeve. So for now, I'll just leave it as it is. In my opinion, the best games aren't necessarily always the ones you've been anticipating for months or the ones in your favorite franchise. Sometimes a game can come out of nowhere and really pique your interest simply because you didn't have any expectations. That's exactly what happened for me with this game. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is a wonderfully made, adventurous game that, despite a few small flaws, definitely is worth your time. Though I am absolutely convinced that this game is meant for a very specific audience. And in that way, it's probably a big reason why I like it so much. Endless exploration, direct and indirect storytelling, lots of secrets and collectibles to discover, all filling up these genuinely beautiful environments. The slower pacing gives the game enough breathing room to tell an interesting story, which has memorable characters and some great looking cinematic moments. It really does feel like you're in a movie, and the developers used some neat tricks in order to portray it as such. I'm really happy to see that The Great Circle tells a completely new and unique story within this franchise, while simultaneously remaining true to the things that made those first 3 Indiana Jones movies so great. But in between all my positivity towards this game, I can definitely also see its flaws. I really don't enjoy the game's traversal, and because the game focuses so much on stealth and exploration, the parkour mechanics and much of the combat can sometimes feel a bit like an afterthought. Which is exactly why I think that this game caters much more towards actual Indiana Jones fans and people who like a slower pace and exploration. And that is definitely something to take into consideration if you're a person that leans more towards enjoying those other gameplay aspects. But despite its flaws, this is still a ridiculously enjoyable game. Thanks for watching. As always, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, consider liking this video or subscribing to my channel, since in that case you might also like my other videos. Please leave a comment to let me know what your opinion on Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is. I'd really like to know. But for now, I just hope to see you in the next video. Bye!
Alright, let's get this over with.
Father, forgive me because I've sinned. I had an affair with my mother-in-law and...
It's alright. Just say 3 Hail Marys.
No, Father, you don't understand. My wife is expecting a child and I fear that...
What?
Yeah, let me finish, please. I fear that...